Hi, this is Nick Freitas, and welcome back to Making the Argument. Today we're going to be talking about some legislation, which is actually before the Virginia General Assembly. Now, before you check out, if you don't live in Virginia, understand that what we're going to be going through today is talking about this legislation because A, it's actually appearing in states all over the country, but B, what I really want to get to is the whole idea that a lot of legislation, when you look at the titles, it sounds perfectly fine, or it might even sound positive. But when you actually read the fine print, that's when you realize that there's a lot of bad things associated with a particular bill. And this is really important for us to discuss because unfortunately the press does not do a very good job of actually looking into these bills and providing context and sharing different perspectives, which demonstrates some of the fundamental flaws behind what's actually being done in the legislation. Let me give you an example of this that I experienced once with a member of the press. So a couple years back, we had a bill which was red flag laws, right? It actually passed in Virginia last year. Now, if you looked at the way that the left kind of advertised this bill, they called it a suicide prevention bill. Right? Well, what the bill did was it said that if somebody lodged a complaint against you, or they said that they thought that you might be a danger to other people or yourself, a magistrate, so not a judge, a magistrate could sign a protective order which would then authorize law enforcement to show up to your house and confiscate your firearms. Now, keep in mind, you haven't done anything wrong, you haven't violated any laws. It's just that if a magistrate now decides that they think that you're a threat, and keep in mind, they're now incentivized to consider you a threat since there was a complaint, they can now deprive you of your Second Amendment rights while affording you like no due process of law before they take your firearms. So I pointed out all of this, and I had a member of the press that was there as I was explaining all the different problems with this bill and how I thought it was a violation of not only your Second Amendment rights, but it was also a potential violation of your Fourth Amendment rights, your Fifth Amendment rights, and actually could be used to infringe on your First Amendment rights. So I provided this whole explanation on why I thought that there was a lot of unintended consequences, and while the intentions might be good, it was not a good bill. How did this particular reporter in my hometown newspaper, how did this particular reporter report on this? He said, Delegate Freitas votes against suicide prevention bill. Now, that's not even close to being objective reporting. That's essentially regurgitating talking points from the left without even doing the most basic analysis of the potential second and third order effects of the legislation. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about some of the other legislation that we're starting to see come up in state houses all across the country, and we're going to discuss why it may sound good, but there's a lot of problems with it. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. First one, HB 2090, right? This was a bill that Republicans actually carried, and what it is set aside $100 million in CARES Act funding, and it was all there to reimburse parents for things like tutoring, curriculum, and other things that they needed to help their children in the midst of schools being shut down, right? So you can no longer send your child to their school, you can't get in-person learning, and so a lot of parents were coming out of pocket in order to buy additional educational materials in order to make sure that their kids could keep up, right? And the Democrats completely shut this down. They didn't even let it get out of subcommittee. So there was no chance for the full committee to vote on it, no chance for all the members of the House of Delegates to be able to vote it on the floor. It was just, nope, we're not going to provide this additional funding to parents that were essentially forced into a situation by their government who had shut down their schools to spend additional money providing for this curriculum, tutoring, and other assistance that their kids might have needed, all right? Here's another bill, HB 2003. This is a bill that, I can't even believe this was given the consideration it was. And it ended up getting amended somewhat, but it still passed. And this banned non-official school ratings from advertisements. So if you're looking for a house, right, one of the primary things that people look for when they're buying a new house is what are the schools like in that particular area. And this delegate actually wanted to ban being able to use any non-official school ranking system. So you have private organizations all the time that will go through, they'll look at different schools, they'll find different ways to rate them based off of everything from, curriculum or graduation rates, the amount of crime involved within the school itself. And they will rank schools in order to help consumers that are looking to buy a house make a good decision if the local school district is really important to them. And again, he wanted to ban non-official reports. So what this means is that the only report that you could use in order to assess whether or not you wanted to buy this home with respect to the school division was one that the government offered. So now we're relying on the government to accurately rank schools in order for you to make a decision. Now, this is, I mean, clearly as it was written, I think it was a violation of First Amendment rights, but I just find it amazing that we would want to pass legislation that essentially told private companies or private entities that were reviewing schools that, you're not allowed to use that in official advertisements. Again, we were able to amend some components of this, but it was very, very problematic. And the fact that someone would even bring this bill forward suggests to you that they want to essentially squash any sort of non-official ranking system. So if it's not a ranking system that the government gets to control, they don't want you to be able to use it, apparently, with respect to people advertising on why you should buy a home in a particular area. So again, very problematic. Another one was, teachers and other licensed school board employees having to go through cultural competency in order to renew their license or get a teaching license in Virginia. Now again, you might look at this and say, well, cultural competency sounds important. Obviously, when you're educating kids and that child walks into the classroom, they're not just bringing themselves, they're bringing all of the baggage that they have. It could be stuff within the home. It could be stuff within the community. Maybe there's crime in the community, or maybe there's other problems that are affecting their ability to learn. And so a reasonable person might look at this and say, okay, yeah, cultural competency could be important for a teacher to be able to effectively engage with a student. The problem is who gets to decide what cultural competency looks like? Right? It's not the school district, it's not you as a parent, it's not even the teachers. Now a government agency is going to be deciding whether or not your teacher, no matter how good they are, no matter how happy you are with that teacher, if they don't give the right answers to the cultural competency test, which, oh, by the way, is being inundated with ideas from, or is potentially being inundated with things from like the 1619 Project, which believes that the country is just founded on racism and bigotry, or critical race theory, where now, teachers have to essentially buy into a particular theory about race in order to be able to keep their teacher's license. Again, the big problem with this is not the idea that we want teachers to be culturally competent with respect to the students that they're teaching. It's who gets to decide what cultural competency looks like. And if it's the government deciding that, or if it's politicians, which have a very, very clear agenda and political motivation behind what that sort of cultural competency education looks like, well, you can be guaranteed that teachers are going to potentially be denied their license unless they repeat whatever left-wing ideology they're now being commanded to understand and essentially employ within their classrooms. So that was another bill that passed the House, and again, I think it's going to have a lot of problems. And once again, it's a part of this mindset that it's not you, the parent, with your children deciding what determines a competent teacher based off of whether or not your child is getting a good education. No. It's going to be some distant bureaucracy that gets to decide that for you. And I don't think that's right. Let's look at another one here. Let's move into some of the economic stuff we saw this year. So income tax conformity. Again, don't fall asleep. Right? Here's what this means. Obviously, the federal government puts out guidance for filing your taxes. And the state, we generally conform to what the federal government's guidance is when we're making our own tax law so that people can file their taxes on time, right? And this is generally a bill that's pretty innocuous. It goes through fairly easily every year. And we just want to make sure that everybody in Virginia can file their state and federal taxes without any major hiccups or having to go back and make amendments or corrections later. This year, however, they decided to put on additional requirements with respect to how you had to file if you received money from the government. So if you were a business and you received money from the government in order to make sure that you could keep your employees on staff or that you could keep your business open. All right, the idea was that when you got that, you weren't going to be forced to pay a bunch of state taxes on it, because we all recognized it was in the midst of a crisis, and this was not just a random government handout, right? This was something to help keep you in business, because it was, after all, the government that was shutting down a lot of these businesses. Well, they put an additional language into it now to where people that took those loans that thought that they weren't going to have to pay additional taxes on it are now going to have to pay those taxes on it. And so it's kind of a bait and switch, and it's going to have drastic effects for a lot of our businesses. Now, they said they wanted to prioritize small businesses, but if you look at the numbers they put on, it wasn't small businesses they were prioritizing, it was micro businesses. And unfortunately, a lot of our small businesses are the ones that are suffering the most. So again, it was another one of these ways that the government promised one thing, and now when it comes time to pay your taxes, a lot of small businesses are going to find out that they owe a lot more than they originally anticipated because they took those federal funds in order to try to keep their businesses open or to try to keep their employees on staff. So the overall consequence is not just going to be paid by the small businesses, right? This is one of those kind of, I don't know, misunderstandings between Republicans and Democrats a lot of the time. Is the Democrats have this idea that they're looking out for the little guy, they're looking out for the employee, whereas Republicans only care about the business owner. No, we care about both, and we understand that if you punish the business financially, you severely limit their ability to pay their employees, to hire new people, to expand their business so that they can actually provide goods and services that we all want. And this was just another demonstration of left-wing ideology coming in to a plan which, again, is going to result in a bait and switch for a lot of our businesses. It's not just going to hurt the business. It's going to hurt every employee that they were trying to keep on board and trying to make sure that they had a job through the pandemic. So again, another problem with the tax conformity bill that we're passing this year. Here's another one on economics and regulatory policy, which I think is a perfect example of something that sounds good, but carries a lot of baggage with it. And I'm going to talk about two bills here. One had to do with essential workers receiving hazard pay. So the government, and again, you look at that, essential workers receiving hazard pay, hey, that sounds like it makes sense. Here's the problem. If you work at a grocery store and they declare a state of emergency, and then they also decide that grocery stores are essential businesses, right? Because obviously we still need to be able to go and get our food and the toilet paper that was flying off the shelves and all that good stuff through a crisis. Well, now they've mandated that each one of those people working at the grocery store, they have to get a 50% pay bump. Now, again, that might sound great, and if you're one of the grocery store workers that keeps your job through all of this, you might really appreciate the fact that you're getting a significant pay bump during a crisis. The problem is that this is going to cause one of two things to happen. Either A, prices for products are going to go up significantly in a time when people can't afford to pay additional money for it, or businesses are going to have to fire employees because they can't afford to keep people on staff like that, or they're going to have to shorten their hours. And so now a good sounding bill results in a situation where maybe stores have to close earlier because they can't afford to keep as many people on staff. People that really desperately need a job right now lose their job because the business can't afford to pay the additional amount, or the prices of the goods and services that you need go up in order to meet the additional compensation. And again, I don't think there's anybody out there that doesn't sympathize or doesn't want people to be taken care of, especially in times of a crisis. But when the government just decides this is what it's going to look like, it doesn't really make the necessary considerations for how this is going to affect businesses, especially in different parts of the state where they might not be able to afford this at all. It has a lot of unintended consequences. So again, sounds nice, creates a whole issue of problems. Here's another one that passed, HB 2016, paid sick time. So this bill said that if you work 30 hours or more a week, you get 40 hours of paid sick time. Now again, a lot of people look at this, especially during a health crisis, and they think to themselves, well, my gosh, why wouldn't a business offer paid sick time? Well, again, most businesses do, but a lot of your smaller businesses, especially ones that have a high turnover rate, it's someone that works at a business for maybe 6 months to a year and then they leave. It's not necessarily a long-term career. You're now telling all those business owners that they've got to add a significant higher amount of money onto what it costs to hire that employee. And this is one of the things, again, when we're talking about making the argument, this is one of the things we want to put forward. It might sound nice, but there's three essential things that every business is looking at when they hire someone. The first question they ask is, can they do the job? The second question they ask is, can I afford to pay them what it is that they want in order to do the job? And the third question is how much liability is associated to paying or is to hiring this person? So if you make it really expensive, or if you add a bunch of additional liabilities, so where someone comes on and works 30 hours and now they're taking 40 hours of sick time, that creates a huge burden for the small business. And so now they're less likely to hire people, or they're less likely to give someone a chance or an opportunity to work for them if they don't know them, or if they don't have a personal relationship and they're not reasonably sure that they're not going to potentially take advantage of something. Again, you might say, well, look, we don't think people are going to take advantage of this. It doesn't matter, and you're right, maybe most people want it, but the business owner still has to take that into consideration. And so again, at a time when we want people to be able to get a job and to be able to keep a job, we're making it significantly harder to hire them, right? So that, again, that's what this sort of interference, government interference into the marketplace does. It sounds nice, and it's not just businesses that are hurt. Again, it's those people that are seeking jobs or want to keep their jobs or want to keep the number of hours that they have. So that's the problem with things like paid sick leave or mandating paid sick leave. Again, nothing wrong with the business wanting to provide that. A lot of businesses do, but a lot of our smaller ones, they're not providing it because they're mean-spirited people. They're not providing it because they can't afford to. The other thing to take into consideration whenever the government adds these sort of mandated benefits is that the cost for that has to be made up somewhere. So, for instance, the business might be paying you $10 an hour to work somewhere. That doesn't mean that you cost the business $10 an hour. It means you cost them $10 an hour plus the money they have to pay into unemployment insurance, plus the money they have to pay into sick leave, plus the money they have to pay into potential hazard pay and all of these other additional criteria. So instead of you being able to go in there and say, you know what, I don't necessarily want these other things, I would just rather get paid $14 an hour or $15 an hour or whatever it is, that option has been taken off the table. You no longer have the ability to negotiate a pay and benefits package between you and your employer that works best for your needs. The government has now interjected, supposedly on your behalf, to decide what you need. And again, the problem is that you have less choices and there's less job opportunities because of the additional costs associated with hiring people. Right? So that's one of the problems associated with that. Let's look at some other ones here. All right, let's move into another category, and I'm going to tell you this one was really frustrating for me. We have close to 2,000 kids in Virginia foster care. I think it's around 1,800, a little bit more specifically, that are waiting to be adopted. And over time, we've adjusted the law with respect to adoption. It used to be a little bit more. It used to be more restrictive. So for instance, for a while there was prohibitions on state plans working with people that were same-sex couples. And they made the argument that, look, if you have kids that are trying to get out of foster care and need to be adopted into loving homes, well, you shouldn't be preventing same-sex couples from being able to adopt, all right? And the law was changed in order to do that because, again, the argument was in a situation like this, we need all hands on deck. And so even if you believe that a family would be better with a mother and a father, right? The idea is that it's still better to get a kid out of foster care and get him into a loving home. And again, people can debate, they can have differences of opinion on what's ideal for the child, but pretty much everyone agreed that leaving him in foster care was not ideal, right? And so a lot of people, we adjusted the law to permit that. One of the things that we put into the law, though, and Delegate Todd Gilbert had put this in several years back, was a conscience clause, which said that as the state is working with these various adoption agencies, and sometimes there's tax benefits associated with it, sometimes there's tax credits and other different benefits associated with getting kids out of the foster care system and into stable homes. We put in a conscience clause that said, look, the state is not going to discriminate against a religious organization if they want to prioritize the adoption services they provide in accordance with their religious beliefs. So obviously an organization like Catholic Charities, when they're looking for adoptive homes, they're looking for a mother or father, they're looking for probably someone that shares similar religious beliefs in order to facilitate that particular adoption. Now again, them providing that service doesn't prevent any other adoption agency which doesn't take those same things into consideration from being able to operate or being able to get the same state benefits, right? It was just saying that we're not going to punish an organization like Catholic Charities or another religious organization that provides these kinds of services because they're holding to their religious faith, right? We see that as a right protected by the First Amendment. It's enshrined in the Virginia Constitution as well. Well, this year, Delegate Mark Levine decided to remove the conscience clause. So it essentially said that organizations like Catholic Charities could no longer participate within that state program. Now, again, the press likes to talk about this as this was an anti-discrimination bill. No, it was a different discrimination bill. That's all it was. It was a different type of discrimination. And what's going to end up happening now is the people that are going to lose out are not various adoption agencies. The people that are going to lose out are the 1,800 kids in foster care waiting to be adopted. And again, Catholic Charities has done wonderful work in getting kids placed into stable, loving homes, just like other organizations have. So the idea that we're going to now exclude them from the process just goes to show that certain people that for years argued that this should be an all hands on deck effort didn't really believe it. And they now see this as another opportunity to push their particular agenda and their particular view onto everybody else. Again, I thought we were trying to get away from that, but now it's become very clear under the new Democrat majority that they're actually going to encourage that kind of government discrimination against religious organizations. And again, the people that lose out are the kids. All right, let's look at another one. Essential health benefits, abortion coverage. So again, regardless of where you stand on abortion, personally, I'm very pro-life because I think all of the science shows that human life begins at conception. At conception, you meet all the scientific criteria that we use to distinguish between life and non-life. You meet all the scientific criteria that we use to distinguish between human life and non-human life. And you meet all of the legal criteria to be determined innocent. So at the moment of conception, whether you like it or not, that is an innocent human life. Now, obviously, abortion is legal in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We understand that there are providers that provide abortion services. What we've always said is that it is wrong to force taxpayers to subsidize abortion. And so there's been various amendments we've had. You've heard a lot of talk about the Hyde Amendment, which says that if money goes to an abortion provider, it can't be used to provide an abortion. Now, even that is somewhat tendentious because obviously money is fungible, right? And if I'm saying that, hey, here's a pile of money, but you can't spend it on abortion, okay, well then the abortion provider spends that money on something else and then take the money they would have spent on that other product or service and now reallocates that toward abortion. So ultimately it still ends up going to abortion providers. But we tried to put in certain safeguards which said that we're not going to tax subsidize the taking of an innocent human life in the act of an abortion. Right? Well, that's now going away. That's now going away for state health insurance coverage plans. So your tax dollars are now directly going to fund abortions. And one of the reasons I find this especially offensive is that I actually have really good friends that are abortion survivors. And what this now means is that Virginia is changing its law to tell an abortion survivor that they have to now subsidize through their taxes the very industry that tried to kill them. I think that is just horrendous and immoral. But yet, that's what's being passed within the Virginia legislature now. Now, again, the press will sometimes cover this as, oh, we're just expanding health coverage. No, or we're expanding women's health coverage. No, what we're doing is we're forcing taxpayers to include abortion survivors to subsidize the abortion industry. That's what's actually taking place. Let's move on to some other ones that have to do with wages and prevailing wage laws. So prevailing wages, and again, this is kind of go back into more in the economic sphere. Prevailing wages is laws that were passed, and some at the federal level, some at the state level. And in a lot of ways, if you really want to look at the original argument for things like prevailing wages or these various labor contracts which favor unions, and to some degree even minimum wages, a lot of these things were passed, and I'm not saying that they are by their very nature racist, but there was a lot of people that supported these sort of prevailing wage laws that did have racist intentions. You had circumstances where minority companies or minority labor was coming in and undercutting other union-backed companies or union-backed labor. And so prevailing wage laws essentially required governments, when they were looking at contracts, to have to pay whatever the prevailing wage was. And again, largely this was determined by a combination of politicians which had been put in office largely through the support of labor unions. Now, again, I want to caveat this. I don't personally have a problem with labor unions. I have a problem with the government tipping the scales in favor of one group over another group. I believe in equality before the law. Well, that's not what this bill does, right? By prevailing wage, they're essentially giving preferential treatment to unions that come in to provide these contracts. And what it essentially ends up doing is a lot of the public work projects that your tax dollars are paying for are now going to be more expensive because it can't go to somebody that offers a better price if they're not in line with what the government has determined prevailing wages are. So again, when you hear the press talk about this, they're not going to go into all of the other, second and third order effects of what this is going to mean for your taxes, what it's going to mean for the expense of government projects, transportation projects, etc. But that is the second and third order effect, and you need to be aware of it. Let's go to one of our favorite topics, the Second Amendment. There was some bills passed this year. Now, the year before, Democrats came with a bunch of confiscation bills. I mean, every Democrat that said nobody wants to take your guns, what we found out is when they took power, yeah, they do. They do want to take your guns. And we actually had bills last year that went so far as to say that if you had a magazine, not even a gun, if you had a magazine that carried more than 12 rounds, right, for each one of those magazines that you owned, you could spend up to a year in jail if you didn't turn them in. Right, so it was a form of government confiscation of both firearms, and again, we're not talking about fully automatic machine guns here. We're talking about typical, weapons that people have been legally permitted to own, that they should be able to own, and various accessories like those magazines. Right, that's what they tried to do last year. And that bill passed out of the House. It was the Senate that carried it over to next year. Well, this year, what changed? How come they didn't carry some of those bills? It's an election year. So now they know that if they carry a lot of these bills, people are going to be paying attention and it could cost them their seat. So they try to go with some more subtle anti-Second Amendment bills this year. I'm going to list a couple ones. This first one, again, if you read it on the surface, it sounds like it makes sense. So it's HB 2319. This was access to firearms, cohabitants, civil penalty. What it essentially means is that if you are cohabitating with someone that is not legally permitted to own a firearm, and you don't have your firearm locked up in a safe, separate with the firearm, firearm has to be unloaded, ammunition has to be stored somewhere else, and it has to be all locked up. If you don't do that, you can now get a civil penalty, which carried up to a $500 civil penalty. Now again, some people might look at that and say, well, yeah, if you're living with somebody that was a convicted felon, or if you're living with someone that was convicted of domestic violence or whatnot, well then yeah, you don't want them to have access to firearms. Here's the problem. You've now created a situation where if someone is staying with you and you don't take their firearm away, if you're cohabitating with them and you don't take that firearm away and put it in a safe and lock it up to where they don't have access for it, you can get a $500 civil penalty. So if you are the subject, if you are the object of the abuse, if you're the one that has been harmed, you're now the one that can get the $500 penalty because you didn't lock up that firearm. So again, it sounds nice, and I guarantee you the press is not going to talk about how this can actually be used to hurt the very people that it's supposed to help, right? But that is the unintended consequence. And those of us that try to bring that up, and by the way, it wasn't just Second Amendment groups, it wasn't just pro-gun advocates, it was left-wing groups that said, hey, I think there's some really bad unintended consequences of this bill. Didn't matter. It was anti-gun, and it flew through. So that bill passed. We had another bill. Again, this is one where it sounds okay until you start to realize what it does. So HB 1909, school board property, establishment of gun-free zone permitted. So all of our schools are gun-free zones. Now, we could have a very good argument, and if you want to follow the science, we can show how gun-free zones haven't really stopped people from actually going to gun-free zones and committing horrendous acts of violence. So rather than actually looking at it like, okay, does this process work? They decided to rapidly expand it. So it used to be that if it was school grounds, so your kid's middle school, you can't bring a gun on school property. Doesn't matter if you have a concealed carry permit, you can't bring the gun on school property. Now they expanded it to essentially anything that the school board leases. So if they lease a separate facility for some sort of event and it's temporary, the moment they lease that facility, now it's an automatic gun-free zone. Right? And this doesn't even allow for common sense policy at a local level. It's just we're going to mandate this now, and this is the way it's going to be. And again, there's unintended consequences from that. You can imagine someone, leasing maybe a farm area for a school event or for a graduation ceremony or for an off-site event of some kind. Well, now if there's firearms within the premises that you just leased, are those people violating the law? Well, according to this, they are. And so what it's also going to do, it's going to create an environment where if you're someone that typically leased out certain property that you owned, but you have your home there, well, are you going to lease it out to the school board anymore? Probably not, because you don't want to run afoul of the law and you don't want to have to take all of your firearms to some other location, which might not even be as secure as your own home, in order to lease that property. So again, part of the unintended consequences of what might sound like a common sense bill. Here's another one that we actually had a really interesting floor debate on, and we showed how absurd the bill was, to the point where even Democrats had to amend the bill in order to get it passed. And that one had to do with carrying firearms in the Capitol Square and the surrounding area, right? This is, Delegate Rob Bell did a good job of asking Delegate Mark Levine, what exactly constitutes a surrounding area? Is it the sidewalk outside? Is it the road that you're traveling down? Is it the parking garage on the other side of Capitol Square? And the answer was, yep. But this bill was originally written so broadly that it wasn't just firearms. A taser counted. If you had a tactical flashlight, right? And look, as a former Green Beret, there are things like tactical flashlights. And what it does is it does like a high-powered strobe, and it has the ability to temporarily impair an attacker so somebody can get away. This bill was originally written so broadly that if a man or a woman was walking down the street, not even on Capitol grounds, walking on the street, and had a strobe flashlight in their purse, they had now violated the law and could be prosecuted for that. It was originally written so broadly that if you were just driving down 9th Street and you're a concealed carry permit holder and you had a firearm in your trunk, you now violated the law. Now, they were able to change some of that, but it's still so bad that if me as a legislator, if I'm parked in the parking garage and I have a firearm with me, I'm now in violation of the law. Even if I don't carry the gun into the government-owned Pocahontas building, I don't carry it into the Capitol, I don't carry it into the Capitol Square, I don't do any of that. If it's just in my car, right, and I'm sitting there with it in the car, I've now violated the law. Again, this is this idea, and here's what's so fascinating, right? The same people that think that guns are the problem, when it's their lives on the line, they want more guns. They want more Capitol Police. They want more National Guardsmen. They want more fences. They want all this protection for themselves. And when we brought up that we have legislators that are concerned because Richmond is not the safest place on the planet, they were concerned that if they were carrying something for their own protection, they're no longer legally allowed to do that. And Delegate Levine's response was, well, you can call the Capitol Police and have them escort you. Well, that works out great for us as legislators. What about our constituents? But once again, as long as Delegate Levine is safe, because he's got taxpayer-funded security in the form of Capitol Police, I guess the rest of us, the rest of us plebs, we don't get the actual ability to be able to defend ourselves. And this bill, again, they amended it. They took out some of the worst parts of it, but it's still a horrible bill. And that passed right through the House of Delegates and is now on to the Senate. So again, this is just a small list of some of the Second Amendment bills that passed. But overall, the reason why I wanted to do this is not just to give you kind of a session update. So if you do live in Virginia, this is kind of a once over the world of some of the legislation that has gone through the General Assembly this year. If you don't live in Virginia, I guarantee you similar bills are being recommended and being sponsored in or patroned in states all over the country. And so beware, because again, for a lot of this legislation, it's not like the press is going to give you this kind of analysis about what the bill actually does or what the real world consequences are. One of the common statements we have in the General Assembly is, we don't legislate intentions, we write laws. And those laws are going to be strictly interpreted and strictly enforced. And so your intentions might be nice. You might want people to be safer. You might want employees to get more benefits. You might want teachers to be more culturally competent. But again, none of that legislation guarantees any of those things. It simply writes out laws, which now other executive branch agencies are going to interpret, and there are unintended consequences to each one of these bills that are going to drastically affect the way that you live your life, the way you get your health care, the way you pay taxes, the way your children are educated, whether or not you can defend yourself, and all of these went through. And so just to kind of sum up all of this, when we're making the argument, because again, one of the biggest disadvantages that you have if you're approaching this from a conservative mindset is that all of those cultural institutions, and we talked about this in the previous couple of episodes, all of those cultural institutions are very happy to simply repeat a narrative or to repeat the stated intentions of the legislator. Here's what I always tell people when I'm talking to them about how to analyze legislation. Spend about 10 seconds considering the stated intentions of the legislator. I'm not saying intentions don't matter, but intentions don't tell you what a bill is going to do. Spend the rest of your time carefully reading what the legislation does. And here's what you need to ask yourself. What sort of incentive structure is created? Because people operate based off of incentives and disincentives. If you encourage something, you get more of it. If you discourage something, you get less of it. And a lot of these bills have really nice sounding intentions, but when you break it down into how will this truly affect human behavior, right? How are people going to react to this? And what are the consequences? What are the incentives that are set up? That will tell you what the legislation will actually accomplish. And unfortunately, a lot of these bills are going to create an environment where Virginia is far less business friendly. And being business friendly is not just about the business. Being business friendly is about making sure that people have economic opportunities. The best way to rise up the economic ladder is not for the government to be cutting people checks or to be trying to mandate through the law what they think your job should look like. The best way to do it is to allow more of a free market environment where people are able to cooperate, people are able to compete with one another, people are able to negotiate their own contracts so that it works best for them and their family, not what the government says it should look like. All right, so that's what's so important. I would really encourage you, look at the incentive structure that the bill has created, right? And don't just take it at face value. Just because a bill says, well, we want to make sure that, essential workers get hazard pay. Okay, that's your intention, that essential workers will get hazard pay. Does that mean that will happen? Yes, for some of them. What does it mean for other people that were working those essential jobs? They're going to lose their job, or their hours are going to be significantly cut because now they can't afford to pay the additional pay. Right? That's the incentive structure. That is the other side of the coin that the press so often neglects to tell you about. And that's why you have so many people looking at the title of a bill and thinking to themselves, well, I read up on this. Well, no, you didn't read the bill. You read what the press wanted you to know about the bill. And it sounds common sense. It sounds like you really care about people. But ultimately, if you care about people, you don't just look at intentions. If you care about people, you take the time to analyze and understand how the bill is going to work in the real world. Because there are a lot of things that sound really good on paper, but have drastic consequences once they're actually put into effect. Another thing I want to just talk very briefly about with respect to this legislative session, because this has been really frustrating. Look, I've given floor speeches before that my Democrat colleagues have found offensive. And oftentimes, not every time, but oftentimes they don't come back with an argument explaining to me why I was wrong or incorrect, or why my data was inaccurate, or why my conclusions weren't logical. No, they just come back and talk about how offended they are, as if their being offended negates all of the facts and evidence that I brought to a particular argument. All right, so look, I don't try to offend anyone, believe it or not. I don't try to offend anyone, but if you find the truth offensive, if you find data and evidence offensive, the problem is not with the data and evidence, the problem is with your worldview. And you being offended about something, no matter how authentic your offense is, or no matter how authentic your anger is, that is not a substitute for a good argument. And what I've seen more and more, and we've seen it during this session, there was one case in particular where Delegate Glenn Davis pointed out that some of the legislation that was going forward that was reforming the way they looked at governor's schools, he said that there was a potential unintended consequence where they were going to lower the academic standards associated with getting into governor's schools. And he said that he used the term that lowering the bar could have unintended consequences and that we shouldn't do that. Democrats immediately jumped up and said how offensive they were and how he was dog whistling and how these were racist comments. Anybody that knows Glenn Davis, and I don't always agree with Glenn Davis on policy, but to suggest that Glenn Davis is a racist is absurd. Absolutely absurd. And what's incredible is that the people that were making those claims, they know it's absurd. They all know Glenn Davis. Glenn Davis is one of the most likable guys in the General Assembly. right? Glenn Davis wouldn't hurt anybody. He is desperately trying to do what he feels is best for his constituents, regardless of their skin color or their gender or their sexual orientation. He is just trying to do what's best for his constituents. He leveled up a concern. And instead of them, effectively, now to their credit, there were some Democrats that got up there and said that they didn't think that was a valid concern because of other issues within the bill. I don't necessarily agree with their analysis, but at least they tried to actually address the question, whereas other delegates got up there and just basically accused him of being a racist, and so therefore we don't have to consider what he brought up, the potential problems that he brought up. Again, that is a fence substituting for an argument, and it is a horrible way to make public policy. And we saw this throughout the legislative session, where people get up continually and suggest that if you don't vote for their bill, it's because you're a racist. Right? There was a bill this legislative session to get rid of the death penalty in Virginia, and it passed the House. Now, I'm going to be upfront with you. I'm not opposed to getting rid of the death penalty. I had a problem with voting for getting rid of the death penalty this year because the Democrats have engaged in something, they call it criminal justice reform. I think it's a form of criminal justice reform that has absolutely no consideration for victims. And because they've now created a situation where life without parole no longer means without parole, I didn't feel comfortable voting for the abolishing of the death penalty. I want to make sure that if you have a vicious killer that has brutally murdered and tortured people, we have 2 people on death row in Virginia right now, and they fit that description of people that brutally murdered and tortured people. I don't want them getting out of jail. Now, if it turns out later that they were exonerated because of evidence, great. But I don't think this is going to happen for these 2 guys. And the idea that if we're just going to get rid of the death penalty and now they're going to be released back onto the streets to potentially hurt other innocent people, that's completely inappropriate. We had a delegate get up and say that the death penalty is racist, right? So he's insinuating that if you don't vote the way he wants, you must be a racist. Let me clear something up right now. The death penalty that we have in Virginia is not racist. If you would like to make an argument that the way that the death penalty has been applied in certain cases had racist undertones, or that the judge or that the jury that handed down certain decisions, that they had racist intentions, you can certainly make that argument. And oh, by the way, back when the Democrats were in charge of Virginia in the Jim Crow era, I have no doubt that the death penalty was used in a racist method. But that doesn't make the death penalty itself racist. A bill is racist or not racist based off of the language of the bill. So if they put into the bill that, hey, the death penalty is now legal in Virginia, and we're going to apply it disproportionately toward minority communities, that would be a racist death penalty on its face. Now, but our death penalty doesn't say anything like that. And once again, if Democrats actually wanted to look at the people that were on death row, don't just look at the racial makeup of the person on death row. Why don't you also take a look at the racial makeup of their victims? Right? So to just blanketly state that the death penalty is in and of itself racist is logically fallacious. It's ridiculous. Right? Now, if you want to make an argument that the death penalty has been used in racist ways, that is a fair argument. That is a fair argument. But again, make a fair argument. Because I am someone that is not opposed to getting rid of the death penalty. I want to make sure that victims are taken care of. I want to make sure that the population is safe. I want to make sure that people that engage in violent acts are appropriately punished for it. I think there's a way that we can do that with life imprisonment. So that way, if down the future, new evidence comes forward and the state doesn't kill someone and now we never have a chance to take that back, that all makes sense to me. Those are all logical, rational, reasonable arguments for abolition of the death penalty. But I'm going to have a problem with it if you've already demonstrated, as the Democrats have demonstrated in Virginia these last couple of years, by letting people out on parole that were guilty of murder. They let one person out who was accused of rape. They were being detained. They were accused of rape. They let him out because of COVID. That person went and murdered the person that accused him of rape. I'm sorry, you can call that criminal justice reform. There was no justice involved in that reform. And that leads me to another point. The word justice is something that I hold in high esteem. And we can get into the various Platonic and Socratic and Aristotelian arguments for what justice is, right? But simply put, justice is the idea of the right thing happening to the right person at the right place at the right time for the right reasons, right? Justice before the law is... we set up a legal system to try to ensure equality before the law. I'm not saying we've always achieved that, and certainly there's been points in our history where the law has been deliberately racist or deliberately bigoted, right? But we have since changed those laws in order to try to achieve greater equality before the law. Now, does that mean that all of our work is done? No, nobody's suggesting that. But equality before the law is a lot different. Equality before the law in order to achieve justice is a lot different than what they're talking about now, when all of a sudden it's education justice and environmental justice and racial justice and social justice and economic justice. Justice has become this seasoning that they just sprinkle over everything, and the moment you don't vote against, or the moment you don't vote for their bill, because you think there's bad unintended consequences, or you think it doesn't achieve their stated intentions, well, now all of a sudden you're not just voting against their bill, you're voting against justice. Again, this is sophistry. These are linguistic tricks that people play to try to intimidate you into voting for something that doesn't achieve justice. It might achieve their policy goals, but that doesn't mean it's actually good for the Commonwealth of our constituents. So again, unfortunately, we've reached a point where when one of my Democrat colleagues gets up and talks about, well, this bill is about environmental justice, I'm automatically thinking to myself, okay, I'm going to have to read this really closely, because typically what they mean now is we're going to achieve greater, what they refer to as equity, right? So equality before the law is the idea that when you go before the court, the law looks at you, the law is non-biased. Right? It doesn't discriminate against you because of your wealth or your skin color or your gender, right? And that's appropriate. That's what we want. Equality of opportunity is something that we try to foster within society, where we say that everybody should be able to pursue happiness, pursue the educational desires they have, to pursue the occupational desires that they have, and they should be able to succeed or fail at those things based off of God-given talent, how much work and effort they put into it, but we shouldn't be stacking the deck against a particular person based off of arbitrary considerations, right? That's equality of opportunity. What they're now moving toward with this whole idea of social justice or economic equity is to say that if a particular person or a particular group doesn't have the same amount of wealth as another particular person, another particular group, it must be because of racism or bigotry or sexism or whatever it is. So essentially they're taking one data point or two data points, like, all right, we have this person over here, they're making this much money, we think they should be making this much money, and if they're not, then there's a case of injustice. I cannot stress this enough. To automatically assume that inequity is a result of injustice is incorrect, and it leads to really, really bad policy. Now, it could be that inequality is a result, or inequity is a result of injustice. And if it is, well, then let's find that area within the law where it's creating that sort of injustice, where it's essentially tipping the scales in favor of one person over another person, inappropriately. That's fine. But that's not what we're seeing anymore. We're seeing these broad dynamics, and one of the biggest ones that loves to put out is what they call the gender pay gap. And you see all these Democrats suggesting that women are paid essentially 75 cents on the dollar. And it is patently absurd. If you actually look at the economic statistics, what you find is that there is almost no gender pay gap. When you actually account for things like education, number of hours worked, the type of jobs people go into, that actually accounts for the differential that you see between what women typically get paid in the economy versus what men get paid in the economy. Right? The way that they get to that 25% gap is they don't look at the sort of jobs that are being done. They don't even look at the total number of hours worked. They just say that, well, this percentage of women or this percentage of people in the marketplace are women, this percentage are men. Men are making 25% more, therefore there's a pay gap. Would you break it down by the individual occupations that they are looking at, the number of hours worked, the education associated with it, all of a sudden that pay gap disappears. When you actually start comparing apples to apples, which is to say a woman working in the same field with the same expertise, working the same amount of hours, essentially makes just as much as men. But they keep pushing this narrative, which has been destroyed by any sort of reasonable economic analysis. They're doing two things. One, they're trying to create this narrative that if you don't vote for their bill, which is creating more economic set-asides or punishing certain businesses or excluding them from competition, well, then it's because you're anti-woman. No, it's because I think you're creating an unfair playing field. And in a lot of these issues, they're actually creating additional liabilities to hiring women. So if a business owner knows that, okay, I've got two people that are equally qualified, but if I hire the woman, I have a much higher percentage of getting sued, well, you've just added a greater liability to hiring the woman. And so someone like me looks at that and says, well, I don't want to put women at a competitive disadvantage in the marketplace, and so I think this bill might have unintended consequences. Nope, you're anti-woman. It's completely intellectually dishonest, right? And even if you come back and you look at the statistics and you say, well, you know what, Nick, I see what you're saying, but I still think that this is a good policy. That's fine. We can agree to disagree, or we can find maybe a compromise on how we can work that policy so that we're not creating a situation where women are put at a competitive disadvantage. But if you're just going to say that, well, no, if you don't agree with me, you're anti-woman, or you're racist, or you're bigoted, or you're sexist, well, then don't tell me you're interested in unity. Don't tell me you're interested in actually coming together to find common ground and work on things to make it better for everyone. You're not interested in unity. You're interested in conformity. Again, you're using sophistry to intimidate and humiliate people into voting for your bill, not convincing them of the overall efficacy of it by addressing legitimate economic concerns. And we've seen this all throughout this legislative session. So, again, as you look at some of these bills, as you read the news on some of them, as you see commentary on them, the only thing I would encourage you to do, and I'm not telling you to don't listen to the Democrats. No, listen to their arguments for their bill. But if all they're giving you is stated intentions, or if all they're giving you is very, very selective statistics that don't accurately take into account enough data points to be considered good analysis, well, then that's an indicator. That's an indicator that they either don't really understand what their bill does, or they do understand what it does. They have a different agenda than what they're telling you, and they're trying to get one over on you. And one of the things I am always very upfront about is what I am trying to do through my bills and the mechanisms that I use to achieve those things. Because I want everyone to be able to make a good, informed decision on whether or not they support what I'm doing or they don't support what I'm doing. And that's the only way we can actually get to a point of having fair, open, honest, and transparent debate about the laws that we are creating. Because one of the other things that I hear my Democrat colleagues say a lot, and quite frankly, it drives me nuts, is whenever a politician says, all we're asking, I've got news for you. You are writing a law. Laws don't ask people to do anything. Laws tell people to do things, and if they don't do them, they are punished. So let's be honest about what we're really doing. And let's display just a little bit of humility. All right, we don't need to over-legislate. We don't need to try to conform all of our constituents to our way of thinking or our way of behaving. Yes, if someone is behaving in a manner where they are deliberately using fraud or violence or coercion or intimidation in order to get what they want, there is a role for the government to come in there and say, no, you can't do that. There is a role for the government to come on into the role on the behalf of the innocent party in order to protect them. But what we're seeing right now is not something that's going to protect innocent people from being exploited or harmed. What we're seeing is a bunch of legislation based off of people that are legislating on things which they have very little, if any, expertise in, and are now demanding that people behave the way that they think they should in the hopes that it will produce the results they desire. I'm sorry, but I have far more faith in free people working together in voluntary cooperation within the marketplace, choosing to work together and cooperate where they can, choosing to compete where they need to, and choosing to leave each other alone when they don't agree. That's the sort of society I'm fostering, because that's a society based off of individual liberty, of property rights, of free choice. That's the sort of society I want to foster. I do not want to use the power of government to try to compel you to live your life the way I think you should. I want you to be free. I want you to realize the benefits of good decisions. Just like me, I want you to realize the poor consequences of bad decisions so that you can make better decisions in the future. But we're not going to get there if we have arrogant legislators that are attempting to shut down debate by claiming offense or accusing you of being a horrible person when you don't agree, and then over-legislating to where they are trying to micromanage almost every aspect of our lives. All right, so this has been a once over the world of some of the legislation that we've seen here in the Virginia General Assembly in 2021. Again, I want to thank you for joining us. I also want to highly encourage you, please, when you watch these videos, if you like making the argument, then share it with your friends. One of the best ways that we can get these arguments and these ideas out there is for you to share it to your friends, to say, you know what, I think this guy makes a point, and I just wanted you to see it. Also, give us your feedback. Let us know some of the things that you would like us to incorporate into making the argument. If you have a particular issue or a particular argument, if your student just came home from college and is talking about a lot of things that you did not raise them up to believe, but you don't know what the answer is to some of the questions that they're asking, let us know about that. We'd be happy to do an episode addressing the various questions that parents get, that people get, so that you can effectively interact with your coworkers, with your friends, with your family. And again, to do so in a polite, civil way that makes a good argument that you can be proud of, that can hopefully convince other people of your way of thinking. So once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Making the Argument.